Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
It was upon an evening both chill and peculiar in its quietude that I first heard of the strange affair of the shawl wrapped around a secret. Holmes had spent the greater part of the day in one of his darker moods, silent, withdrawn, and wreathed in impenetrable smoke from his pipe. The wet October air clung to Baker Street like a stubborn veil, smudging the lamps into dim halos, and I had resigned myself to the melancholy rhythm of the rain when a rapid series of knocks echoed on our door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a lady, striking in bearing though worn by anxiety. Her attire was of fine quality, but showed signs of haste, the hem muddied, the gloves crushed in her nervous grasp. Holmes did not rise from his chair. He simply inclined his head and observed her in that piercing manner of his, which seemed to flay the truth from a person without a word being spoken. "You are Miss Gertrude Armitage," he murmured, before she had even spoken her name, formerly a companion to Lady Havisham, and now in some trouble most grave, likely connected to a disappearance. "Not a crime of passion, but of concealment," the lady gasped. "How on earth?" Holmes waved an impatient hand. "You have been travelling since morning. The fine clay upon your hem is from the meadows of Surrey, and you have a faint scent of heliotrope, Lady Havisham's favoured perfume, though her recent illness has prevented her from using it. You came to me not because of the lady herself, but of something belonging to her, I dare say." Miss Armitage gathered herself with visible effort. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. It is because of Lady Havisham's shawl." Watson, ever the practical man, leaned forward. "A shawl, madam?" "Yes, doctor," she said in a tremulous voice. "It may sound trivial, but that shawl has brought death into our household." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed? Then I suggest you tell us everything, from the moment the trouble began." The young woman clasped her gloved hands tightly. "2 nights ago the household retired as usual. In the morning, Lady Havisham's shawl, a cashmere of unmistakable weave, was found draped around the gardener's body at the foot of the terrace. He was quite dead, sir. No wound, no mark, save for the odd position of the body and the shawl about his neck. And worse still, Lady Havisham swears that the shawl had been locked in her private drawer the night before." Holmes drew in a deep breath through his teeth, his expression sharpening. "A locked drawer, an impossible presence. A silent death, excellent. Then you will help us," Miss Armitage implored. "Help you?" Holmes rose suddenly, his long frame all energy and calculation. "My dear lady, this is not merely a case, it is a riddle woven of shadow and silk. You may tell Lady Havisham that Sherlock Holmes is, for the moment, entirely at her service." He turned to me with a gleam in his eye that I had not seen in weeks. "Watson, the game, it appears, has resumed. The dawn that followed Lady Havisham's tragic discovery was grey and cold, the kind that seeps into the bones and sets the mind to restless wandering. Holmes and I departed Baker Street, with the early mist clinging to our overcoats, a faint drizzle softening the gaslight's glow as we boarded the coach bound for Surrey. Despite his usual disdain for travelling, Holmes was unusually alert, his eyes scanning every passerby and every idle detail with the precision of a hawk. On the journey, Holmes began his customary meditation aloud, a practice which never failed to illuminate the smallest facts with uncanny clarity. "Watson, you observed Miss Armitage's gloved hands to be somewhat crushed. A trivial detail, some may say, but it confirms the weight of her anxiety, and perhaps a hand wrung in anguish or suppressed frustration." I made a mental note to recall that thread later, while Holmes continued. "And the gardener, fouled by a shawl that had been locked away, is peculiar in itself. Death by strangulation without mark or wound, save that mystifying absence of violence. There must be an alternate cause. Poison? Asphyxiation by some subtle means? Or could it be the shawl itself, woven with something more sinister than silk?" I ventured. Holmes smiled thinly and tightened his grip on the coach's edge. "Exactly why this case transcends the ordinary. The shawl is no mere cloth. It is the key. The question remains, how did it escape a locked drawer, and more importantly, why was it found bound around a man whose demise puzzles even Lestrade's usual competence?" The Surrey countryside unfolded beneath us in muted greens and the distant silhouette of estates, one of which rose before us with the solemn grandeur befitting Lady Havisham's station, Havisham Hall. As the coach rumbled over the gravel, A primeval mist rose from the lawn, shrouding the world in tentative secrecy. Upon arrival, Holmes wasted no time. The towering oak doors opened to admit us into a wide entrance hall, thick with lingering scents of lavender and wood smoke. Miss Armitage met us with eyes sunken from sleeplessness, leading us at a pace matched only by the urgency behind her gaze. "We must first see the drawer," Holmes said keenly, "and understand the circumstances of the shawl's disappearance." In Lady Havisham's chamber, the atmosphere was heavy with subdued grief, mixed with an undercurrent of fear. The room bore the tasteful opulence of a lady accustomed to control and exactness. Holmes knelt by the dresser, inspecting the locked drawer that supposedly housed the shawl the night before the gardener's death. The lock was simple but intact. The drawer itself slightly ajar, not forcibly opened, just imperceptibly shifted. Holmes's eyes flickered to the shawl itself, laid out beside the bureau, delicate cashmere woven in a pattern of deep crimsons and soft golds, yet now stained faintly on its edge with what appeared to be soil. "The gardener was found here," Miss Armitage whispered, voice trembling. "At the foot of the terrace, half concealed beneath the garden yews." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then there will be much to see outside. But before that, Miss Armitage, how well did the gardener know the household? And what was his relationship with Lady Havisham herself?" The young woman hesitated, then with an effort said, "Thomas Clay was loyal and quiet but distant. He rarely spoke of his past or his family. Some in the village whispered that he had secrets, but no one ever suspected foul play until now." "Secrets," Holmes murmured, his fingers drumming upon the velvet shawl, "the very fabric of our inquiry." Our next steps were clear: to walk the grounds, examine the scene, and question those whose shadows lengthened around the unfolding tragedy. Yet even as Holmes prepared his analysis, I noticed a flicker of unusual restlessness in him, as if the case had already begun to slip beyond conventional explanation. The air outside bore the sharp scent of wet earth mingled with fading blooms, and I found myself following Holmes down the misty path toward the terrace, fully aware that the shawl was only the first thread in a tapestry woven with secrets yet to be unraveled. "Would you like me to continue with the next part?" Focusing on Holmes's detailed crime scene examination and the early clues he uncovers, Holmes pressed ahead onto the terrace, his steps deliberate, eyes alive with calculation. I stayed just behind, notebook in hand, the brisk air bracing my senses. The grey garden unfurled beneath the old yews, dew catching the distant glow of morning. With a practiced movement, Holmes squatted at the precise spot described by Miss Armitage, where Thomas Clay's lifeless body had been discovered. He scanned the ground, tweezing aside fallen leaves and tracing the faint impressions left there. I could see by the minute shifts of his brows and the way his gaze lingered that he had already spotted details that escaped my notice. He drew a small magnifying lens from his waistcoat. "The imprint here, see, Watson, the peculiar angle?" Our victim landed abruptly, as if pulled rather than having fallen. "Remark, too, these minute scuff marks upon the flagstones. There was a struggle, yes, but a silent one." He looked up, the hint of excitement in his voice unmistakable. "And here, a thread clinging to the thorn of that yew. Red, fine, unmistakably cashmere." As I knelt to look, Holmes pocketed the thread with swift care, then turned his attention to the lower terrace wall. A series of small muddy footprints trailed away from the scene, too slight for a grown man, and curiously intermingled with the faint marks of what appeared to be worn boots with a distinctive cross-hatching. Holmes rose, contemplating the prints. "Watson, not all of these tracks belong to our unfortunate gardener. Note the disparity in size and pattern. Someone returned here perhaps after the deed. And yet their path circles round, never directly intersecting with Clay's." He knelt down, gathering a pinch of soil, sniffed it, then scrutinized a patch of crushed grass. "Someone cautious, perhaps watching, or retrieving something?" I ventured. Holmes nodded, yet his gaze was distant, already chasing some private train of logic. "We must speak to whoever tended this garden after the tragedy. I doubt the household staff would miss such disturbance beneath Lady Havisham's windows." We were interrupted by a sharp bark and the hurried footsteps of a stable boy who skidded to a halt, cap in hand, a look of genuine fright upon his face. "If you please, sir," he blurted, addressing Holmes with an uneasy respect. "Nanny Phelps said I should show you this. She found it in the hedge not a stone's throw from where they found the gardener." He produced, with trembling hand, a small golden locket. Holmes seized it, inspecting its hinges and the intricate monogram worked onto the cover, L.H. Lady Havisham herself. Opening it swiftly, he revealed within a faded daguerreotype of a man and child, and a slip of folded paper. We fetched a ladder and looked through the window. Mother was sitting quite still. I think I knew then. He glanced at his sister and fell silent. Holmes inclined his head. Quite so. You say you attempted to force the door. Did you damage or loosen the frame in any way? Not that I could tell. The latch held firm. The gardener was the one who opened it after the constables arrived. Holmes folded his hands together. And you were in the library at the time she rang. What were you occupied with? Robert turned slightly, a trace of impatience sharpening his words. Our steward brought in some reports, farm accounts and tenant complaints. I was reviewing them. And your mother? Did she retire to her parlor alone, as was her habit? Yes, she always took an hour to herself after breakfast. It was her time to read or receive her private correspondence. Holmes flicked a quick look toward Lestrade, who continued jotting names and times beside the hearth. Then Holmes leaned forward a fraction. Would you happen to know whether your mother had received any visitors or parcels in recent days? Something or someone unexpected? After a long pause, Robert shrugged. A letter, perhaps 3 days ago. I remember because she seemed put out by it. I asked if something was wrong, but she waved me off. She was private to a fault, Mr. Holmes. Watson, meanwhile, noted the tightness in Mrs. Grimble's brow, her eyes darting toward the floor. Holmes, too, had seen it. You appear troubled, Mrs. Grimble, he said gently. Was there something your mistress said to you that morning? Something unusual? She hesitated a long moment before answering. Only that she was waiting for someone, sir. She told me not to disturb her, not even if the bell rang. But then when it did, well, I thought she'd changed her mind. I didn't think it proper to ignore her. You did well, Holmes said softly. This person she expected, did she name them? No, sir, only that it was a private matter. She seemed nervous-like, pale, pacing about before she went into the parlor. Holmes remained silent for several seconds, his gaze distant. Then, rising, he said, Miss Kent, had your mother any strong enemies? Business rivals, perhaps? A quarrel within the family? Eliza shook her head vigorously. None that I know of. She was charitable, respected, even-tempered to all. Even-tempered, Holmes murmured, yet pacing and anxious. There is always a reason for deviation from one's habits. He turned sharply to Lestrade. Inspector, I believe it may profit us to look again at the parlor, with particular attention to the writing desk. If Lady Kent expected correspondence, it must have touched that surface. We retraced our steps down the hall. The lamps burned lower, their light trembling against the dark paneling. Holmes, upon reaching the parlor, moved to the desk immediately. He examined its top, then each drawer in turn. One was locked, and he asked Lestrade for the key, which was soon fetched from among the ladies' effects upstairs. The drawer slid open with a faint rasp. Within lay several sealed envelopes, one torn envelope with its letter missing, and a small ivory penknife. Holmes lifted the envelopes, fanning them lightly, and smiled faintly at the smell of fresh lavender. All her usual correspondence, murmured Miss Kent from the doorway. Parish matters, social calls. But the torn envelope drew Holmes's notice most keenly. It bore no crest, only an address scrawled in a masculine hand. To Lady M. Kent, private and urgent. The contents were gone. Watson, he said, handing me the envelope, note the coarseness of the paper, the faint crease across the midline, a letter folded and refolded often, I should wager, and taken, removed by a hand that meant to conceal it. You believe it was stolen, then? Lestrade asked. I believe, Holmes returned, that whoever was expected in this room removed it after gaining entry, and before we arrived, he crossed to the hearth and crouched beside the dying embers. From beneath the grate, he drew a thin metal object, blackened by heat. It was the stem of a fountain pen, twisted and charred. Holmes examined its point with a glass, then turned to me. Look closely, Watson. A recent break, the fracture still sharp. Whoever wrote the last message used this very pen. And perhaps, he paused, eyes narrowing, left in haste when it broke. He tapped the vial found earlier, now resting on the mantelpiece. Combine these items, And you have the skeleton of intent, message, poison, concealment. Yet the order of their use is far from clear. At that instant a constable entered, touching his hat. "Beg pardon, Inspector. A message for Mr. Holmes from the stable boy. Says one of the carriages was taken out at 6:30 this morning, before anyone was about." Holmes's expression changed subtly, the faint arch of an eyebrow betraying quick interest. "Indeed," he murmured. "And who, pray, was the driver?" "No one knows, sir." "The carriage has not returned." Holmes straightened with brisk energy, every trace of languor gone. "Then it would seem, gentlemen, that our invisible visitor may have required more than a locked room for their departure." The look he exchanged with Watson carried that unmistakable gleam of impending revelation, though, as I well knew from long experience, the true pattern behind Holmes's deductions still lay veiled in the fog, waiting for its next turn of discovery. Holmes wasted no time lingering in speculation. With the same swift precision that always marked him when the scent of truth was strongest, he turned to Lestrade. "The Inspector, I must ask that you have the stable yard examined at once. Every hoofprint, every wheel rut. Mark them carefully before the rain sets in. The direction taken by that carriage may tell us more than any confession could." Lestrade nodded curtly, and with a word to his man departed toward the rear grounds. The instant the door closed behind him, Holmes paced the parlor, his hands clasped behind his back, his steps sharp as though marking lines of reasoning upon the carpet. "Eliza Kent," he said suddenly, "did your mother's affairs afford her any reason to meet secretly? Financial uncertainties? Contested property, unwanted correspondence?" The young woman flushed at the questioning. "None that I know. Father's will left everything in order. We have no debts, no entanglements that I am aware of." Holmes's tone softened slightly. "And yet she expected a visitor this morning, and one she insisted receive her privately. We must then assume that privacy was the core of the interview, not convenience. You may be sure, Miss Kent, that secrecy is currency in every design of deceit." She looked unsettled, then said quietly, "There is one thing, a matter Mother mentioned in passing some weeks ago. She received repeated notes from a gentleman claiming to know something of our late father's affairs. She would never say what. The letters frightened her, I think. May I inquire what became of them? She burned them, or said she did." Holmes turned once more to the desk and examined the ashes in the small tray set beside the lamp. He poked gently with a letter knife, and a frown deepened upon his features. "Partially burned paper," he murmured. Handwriting in faded blue ink, large, masculine, the downward slant of forceful emphasis. "And here, Watson, look at the phrase 'not wholly consumed.' Cannot remain silent any longer. Curious, is it not, that the same urgency appears in the missing letter's inscription, 'Private and urgent.'" Lestrade's boot sounded in the corridor as he returned, shaking off the damp. "No sign of the carriage, Mr. Holmes. Looks like it went north, up toward the old mill road. Stable boy swears the horses used were Blackthorn Bay pair, Lady Kent's own team." Holmes's face lit with a grim spark. "Her own carriage used by another. Then our visitor either possessed her trust or the key to her stable." "The lock wasn't forced," Lestrade said. "Key was in its usual place on the wall hook. Then it was removed without consent." "Tell me," Holmes said, "who besides Lady Kent and her immediate household has access to the stables?" "The groom, Jenkins. Been with the family 14 years. Solid as they come." "Then we must speak with him," Holmes said simply. We were led through a stone passage into the open yard, the faint drizzle thickening to a silvery mist. The groom emerged from the stable archway, a lean man with wind-tanned skin and a manner of honest simplicity. He bowed stiffly. Holmes's eyes seemed to pierce the man's composure. "Mr. Jenkins, you were aware one of the carriages left early this morning?" The man blanched. "Yes, sir." "That's true enough. I came down about 6:30 and saw the doors open, harness hooks empty. Could have sworn I locked 'em the night before. So I thought maybe mistress had gone into town unexpected-like, but then I found all the house still asleep and I didn't dare wake 'em." "Did you note any tracks?" "Aye, sir, 2 sets of prints. One freshly pressed wagon trail going north, like the inspector said, and a single man's boot marks beside it. Small feet, light tread. Might have been Miss Eliza's, though the shoe wasn't quite so narrow." Holmes crouched, peering at the mud along the cobbles. Indeed, the impression's neat, pointed toe, probably continental make. Parisian, I'd wager. "You see, Watson, the narrow sole, the slight inward cant of the heel. Very fashionable among the foreign set. Now tell me, Jenkins, have you seen anyone new about the grounds of late, foreigners particularly? Jenkins frowned. Can't say as I have, sir. Unless you count the tradesmen. There was a delivery man last Wednesday, but I didn't note his face close. French name on the invoice, though. Beaumont, that's what it said. Beaumont, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. Then half to himself. The scent grows distinct, poison, secrecy, French correspondence, and now a vanished carriage. He turned abruptly to Lestrade. Inspector, might I trouble you to telegraph Scotland Yard at once? Ask them to trace any entries of the name Beaumont. Dealers, chemists, agents, anyone. Particularly those with a connection to imported chemicals. Chemicals? Lestrade repeated. Holmes's mouth curved in the faintest smile. Our bitter almond perfume, Inspector. Cyanide, if Watson's nose is to be believed, and mine seldom contradicts his in such matters. A letter threatening revelation. A lady dead by poison. A vial placed where no victim's hand could have set it. These point toward a visitor, skilled in evasion, not chance. As we returned indoors, Holmes paused within the great hall, listening. The sound of distant footsteps echoed overhead, followed by Miss Kent's uneven breathing as she descended the stair once more. She carried in her hands a small black case. I found this among Mother's things, she said, voice trembling slightly. I remembered it only just. It was kept locked in her bureau drawer. I never saw her open it. Holmes accepted it with a nod and at her permission unlatched the clasp. Within lay an ivory miniature of a handsome man with curling hair, a fine watch chain, and beneath them a folded document. The handwriting matched that of the burned letter. Watson leaned closer, astonishment breaking through his habitual composure. Holmes, the same hand! Holmes's eyes moved swiftly across the page. It is a letter of acknowledgement, he said, signed by one Adrian Beaumont, dated 3 years past. He writes of the debt unpaid and the memory bound to Greyhaven. It seems, Watson, that Lady Kent's ghostly visitor was no stranger. He was a man resurrected by guilt or greed. He turned to Lestrade, energy mounting in his voice. Prepare your men, Inspector. Have them follow the mill road for 5 miles and inquire at every way station and inn. Our carriage thief, our murderer, rides still, and the fog will not mask his trail for long. Holmes pocketed the letter, his profile sharp in the lamplight. Then, as we made for the door, he murmured half to himself, a mother found in her locked parlor, a letter burned, a visitor unseen, a carriage gone north. Every chain has a first and final link, and I mean to find them both before dawn. The wind sharpened across the manor's courtyard as we stepped once more into the night, the clouds sinking low and the lamps burning dim behind their misted glass. Lestrade's men scattered into the fog with orders to search the northern road, their boots splashing against the slick cobblestones. Holmes stood immobile for a moment, his gaze turned toward the black stretch of trees that bordered the estate. The faint whicker of a restless horse drifted from the stables. Watson, he said after a pause, observe what the world might call confusion. It is, in truth, precision cloaked in smoke. Everything here speaks in opposites. A locked door opened without force, a poison administered but not ingested, a carriage taken yet not seen departing. The very contradictions point us toward design. I watched his sharp outline in the darkness, the flare of his cigarette momentarily lighting his face. And who then, I asked, do you believe this Beaumont to be? The letter implies a past connection, but surely, if known to Lady Kent, she would not have received him in secrecy. Holmes exhaled a thin cloud of smoke. I believe Beaumont is not quite the figure he was 3 years ago. Identities, like handwriting, can be forged. A name that frightened Lady Kent need not belong to the true man at all. Consider, a letter arrives in a familiar hand, warns her that silence must end. She grants an interview. Before dawn, she is found dead. The imposture would require only 2 things, a model of her confidence and access to her private affairs. We turned back toward the manor, where pale light glimmered through the drawing-room curtains. Inside, Miss Kent sat by the fire, her brother pacing behind her. The air in the room seemed changed since our earlier visit, charged, uneasy. Robert halted as Holmes entered. Inspector Lestrade tells me you've sent men onto the road. I hope your theory does not intend to drag our family name into scandal, Mr. Holmes. It is not my custom, Mr. Kent, to form theories before possessing facts, said Holmes coolly. But facts have a disquieting habit of disclosing truths, Family pride might prefer concealed. His voice dropped to a note of quiet emphasis. Would you mind explaining why your mother recently withdrew £1,200 from her banker's account in cash? Robert's lips parted in astonishment. How on earth? That's an outrageous intrusion. Lestrade obtained the figure from her papers, Holmes said mildly. The money is unaccounted for. Lady Kent's housekeeping books are precise to the penny, yet this sum is missing. Eliza Kent started, looking toward her brother. Robert, you never told me. He flushed hotly. Because it's utterly irrelevant. It was for some charitable pledge Mother made. She told me she intended to give it in person to a foundation in town. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Which foundation? A pause, then a halting reply. She didn't specify. You see, Watson, said Holmes without looking away, money before murder often explains the latter more readily than sentiment. I will wager Lady Kent's expected visitor came for that money, whether she meant to give it or resist. Eliza's face paled. Then she was robbed? Not robbed, Holmes answered softly, but deceived. She admitted him under her own authority, locked the door herself, and within the hour was dead, with the poison left conveniently behind to suggest self-infliction. But the thief overlooked one detail. The vial was empty, meaning, as I asked, that the quantity that killed her was transported by contact, not by ingestion. A soaked glove or a damp cloth, perhaps. Curious that a man who planned so well would leave behind both message and trace. He paced to the window, touched the pane, and turned sharply. Tell me, Miss Kent, do you recall any guest servant or tradesman in your employ during the last fortnight who wore gloves indoors? She looked startled. Now that you mention it, yes, Mr. Beaumont himself. When he called with his note, I saw him remove one to sign the visitor's register. He had a scar on his wrist as though from a burn. Holmes's entire demeanor altered. He straightened with that quick electric vigor that signaled certainty dawned. Ah, a burn scar, it explains the delicacy. Some manner of chemist's accident. Watson, are you not reminded of the phenomenon of dermal absorption with hydrogen cyanide? A man previously exposed would wear protection afterward. Excellent. The wall tightens around our phantom chemist. Lestrade reappeared, soaked to the shoulders but triumphant. They've found him, Mr. Holmes. A carriage matching the Manners has been spotted just past Limehouse Wharf. The driver abandoned it and boarded a small packet bound for Calais. Too expected, said Holmes gravely. A man burdened with guilt flees. An innocent man would wait to explain. Did your constable note his appearance? Tall, clean-shaven, wore a dark travelling coat. Spoke little English. Holmes smiled faintly. The genuine Beaumont, perhaps. Or a convenient costume borrowed from him, no matter. The game expands across the channel, and I suspect Inspector Lestrade's telegram will precede any steamer in reaching its destination. Still, one thread must be knotted before we chase the next. He looked to Robert Kent again. You say your mother rarely trusted strangers. Yet she received this man privately. How, Mr. Kent, could a letter from him gain her confidence unless it referenced facts, personal facts, only one of her family might supply? Robert's silence stretched long, the firelight flickering bright upon his features. Eliza's gaze shifted slowly toward her brother. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. Robert, what did you do? He turned away, pressing a hand to his brow. I merely wrote him once, months ago. It was nothing. He claimed connection with our father's business interests. He said he might help recover certain investments. I told him Mother might listen if he presented proof. I didn't imagine quite so, Holmes said quietly. You opened the door. He merely walked through. But I do not believe intent lay with you. The pattern belongs to the man who manipulated both your trust and hers. A cough from Lestrade broke the silence. So, Mr. Holmes, you're saying Beaumont, or whoever he is, used the lad to get inside, poisoned the lady to cover theft, and fled the country. For now, Holmes said, tugging thoughtfully at his chin. But we've yet to ask why a man risking murder would bring no money with him, nor any portion of the £1,200. He turned to the table, where the black case lay open. Unless, my dear Watson, the value was not counted in coin. He withdrew from beneath the ivory miniature, a folded parchment sealed in wax. A title deed, he read aloud, to the parcel of land known as Blackmere Orchard, purchased 30 years past. Witness His Grace the Duke of Seek. He snapped it shut. There lies our motive. Beaumont, chemist, impostor, and now claimant to a property of hidden worth, yet unredeemed. A man willing to commit the perfect locked-room illusion for a document granting him wealth. The fire sank low. Outside, the rain grew harder, beating against the panes like cautious fingers. Holmes stood by the mantel in absolute stillness, every line of him alert yet introspective. His mind, I knew, already chasing the final link across the dark waters to Calais. Holmes did not stir for several minutes after discovering the deed. The faint ticking of the mantel clock filled the room, each beat underscoring the intense silence that hung over us. Eliza sat fixed, her hands pressed tightly in her lap, while her brother stood behind her, restless but subdued, as though the weight of his unthinking involvement had only now descended upon him. Lestrade hovered near the door, checking the rain-lashed windows with habitual impatience, yet unable to draw Holmes's attention away from his inward storm of thought. At last, Holmes spoke, his tone measured, deliberate. "Watson, reflect upon this chain of events. A series of threatening letters precedes the death of their recipient. A meeting is arranged, a closed room, no forced entry. The victim's own carriage and key are used, her wealth or estate possibly targeted, yet money remains untouched. Instead, a document of title and an ancient debt bind the living to the dead. What motive surrounds paper more powerfully than gold?" I frowned. "Blackmail, you mean? But to what end, if not for gain?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "Precisely. Blackmail built not on scandal but on heritage. A claim to legitimacy, Watson, not greed. Beaumont, if that was his true name, believed that within this deed lay proof to an inheritance or connection denied. When Lady Kent resisted or threatened exposure, he silenced her. But in doing so, he secured neither acceptance nor access, for murder rarely grants the very legitimacy it seeks." Lestrade, never one for abstractions, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but how do we prove it?" "The man's already fled. The lady's well beyond questioning, and all we've got is a bit of paper and a lot of guessing." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Lestrade, deduction is seldom guessing. The order of events has logic that only needs to be applied. Consider. The poison delivered through contact. Our man enters, shakes her hand, transfers the fatal element already diffused upon his glove. He then retrieves his letter, burns any trace, secures the deed, and escapes almost unseen. But there is one inconsistency: Lady Kent's bell." I looked up quickly. "Yes, she rang it before dying, exactly. Now Watson, a woman of advanced years, seated in her favorite chair, recognizes something amiss. Yet instead of rising or calling for assistance from the hall, she uses the bell, a mechanism attached to the wall by a cord reachable from that particular armchair. She was acquainted with danger, knew precisely whom she faced, and hoped to summon aid discreetly. That, my dear fellow, is the mark of foreknowledge, not surprise." Eliza's gaze lifted, filled with sudden dread. "Foreknowledge? You mean she suspected him even as she met him?" Holmes inclined his head gently. "Quite so. She knew much, but spoke too late." He straightened, his face all steel and resolve once more. "Inspector, the document names Blackmere Orchard. Do we have its current proprietor or tenant in your notes?" Lestrade shuffled through his damp notebook. "The land's been leased these 10 years to a man called Rosier, chemist by profession. French, too, according to the constable's report. Lives between here and Chatham. Rosier," Holmes repeated softly, "which in French means rose tree. A symbolic fellow, then." He drew from his coat pocket a folded scrap he'd recovered near the mantel earlier, a ribbon fragment faintly scented with perfume. He held it under his nose. "And here we have our rose again. The scent is identical, benzaldehyde, the same odor that clung to the vial of poison. Watson, the very essence extracted from bitter almonds." The subtle transformation in Holmes's manner told me more than words. The path was opening before him. Without delay, he moved toward the door. "Lestrade, have your men maintain watch here. I shall require the carriage, yes, the remaining one, and immediate conveyance to Blackmere Orchard. The murderer's vanity will bring him within reach before dawn. A man clever enough to arrange an invisible crime never foresees how visible his pride will make him afterward." The journey through the storm was swift but uneasy. The horses labored through the mud, wheels skidding on the rutted road as we raced through the darkness. The wind climbed in long wailing gusts, rattling the branches overhead. Holmes sat beside me, silent save for the faint clicking of his fingernails against the window pane, a rhythm I knew meant concentration at its keenest. At last, A dim outline of low buildings emerged through the fog. The orchard's cottage, a squat structure with smoke faintly trailing from its chimney. A single lamp glowed in the front window. Holmes raised a hand to halt the driver and leaned forward, peering through the mist. "The light, Watson. Too steady for coincidence. Our man is home." We descended quietly, our boots sinking into the soft earth. Holmes motioned me aside, and we approached the window together. Through the glass, faint figures moved within the glow of the lamp. One man bent over a desk, writing rapidly by candlelight. Another shape hovered near the wall, half obscured. Then the taller of the two turned, revealing a face narrow and pale with a distinct red mark crossing the wrist, just where Eliza had described the scar. Holmes breathed, "Our Beaumont, or Rosier." How poetic that he hides behind both names, each a mask formed of borrowed roots. Before I could answer, the taller man crossed to a cupboard, drew out a leather folio, its corner tipped with the very same parchment seal Holmes had earlier uncovered, and slipped it into a traveling bag. Holmes's hand fell upon my arm. "Now, Watson, before he departs." He rapped hard upon the door. A startled curse sounded from within, followed by the scrape of furniture and the sudden snuffing of the lamp. Holmes's voice, calm and cutting, carried through the darkness. "Open, Monsieur Rosier. Or shall I tell the French police waiting at Calais that the locked parlor murder was administered by your steady, gloved hand?" A stunned silence followed. Then footsteps quick and light. The door burst open. A flash of movement. A shadow darted past me toward the orchard. Holmes sprang like lightning, his figure lost momentarily in the dark, followed by the scuffle of boots and the thud of falling bodies. When the chaos settled, Holmes stood breathing hard, holding our quarry by the collar. Mud streaked both their coats, but the man's defiance was spent. Holmes turned him toward the faint moonlight. "Adrien Rosier, alias Beaumont, chemist, blackmailer, and fool. Did you imagine that a locked room could hide the hand that held the poison?" The man's eyes blazed. "She betrayed my father. She kept his name from me." Holmes's reply was cold. "And you avenged him with mercuric cyanide. Poetic justice, perhaps, but lawless all the same." The prisoner sagged in Holmes's grasp. "She promised to recognize me. I wanted only her word. But she rang that bell and I panicked. I pressed my hand upon hers to stop her, and then she fell." Holmes's voice softened to a near whisper. "Then the mechanism of fate closed around you both. By the time Lestrade arrived, dawn had begun to pale the sky." Holmes handed over his captive without triumph, merely the calm satisfaction of logic fulfilled. As we watched the constables lead Rosier away, the rising mist parted over the trees, and the faintest gleam of sunrise touched the puddles at our feet. Holmes turned to me, his hat in his hand, eyes thoughtful. "A man hides behind science but is undone by sentiment. The formula remains the same, Watson, only the reagent changes. Poison has many forms and guilt the deadliest of all." We rode back toward London in silence, the fog thinning as the city's distant bells began to ring. The rain had eased to a thin drizzle by the time we reached Baker Street. Dawn had chased the fog eastward, leaving the streets slick and gleaming. I could tell from the line of Holmes's mouth that he was not yet satisfied, though the culprit sat shackled in Lestrade's custody, and the mystery, a locked parlor death, had surrendered to reason. He paced before the hearth as Mrs. Hudson brought tea, his movements quick, restless, almost irritable. "You are troubled," I ventured, handing him the cup. Rosier confessed freely. "The evidence matches his account. Surely the matter is resolved." Holmes took the tea but did not drink. His eyes burned with that inward light that meant his mind was sorting and rearranging unseen patterns. "Resolved, Watson, yes, yet not at peace. The logic is complete, but something vital eludes me. Rosier's story tallies with the facts of death, the poison, the letter, and yet it omits one element I cannot reconcile. The bell. The bell again," I exclaimed. "You've said Lady Kent must have rung it when she sensed danger. What more is there?" He turned sharply. "The timing, my friend. Consider, Rosier claims the poison was absorbed on contact. Death, though swift, is not instantaneous with hydrogen cyanide delivered through the skin. It takes time, minutes, not seconds. Yet according to the household, the bell was rung almost at that same instant. How could she have known? She could not have felt its effects. She sensed peril before the act itself." I frowned. "Then she suspected him from the moment he entered." Holmes's smile was faint and grim. Exactly. She recognized in him not a stranger, but a truth she had tried to bury. And what does recognition breed in the wary heart? Fear and resolve. He set his untouched tea aside and crossed to the bookshelf, plucking down his old monograph on hereditary physiognomy. Watson, when I examined Rosier's face, what did you note? His pallor, his scar, and now that you mention it, the remarkable resemblance to Lady Kent's portrait in the parlor. Ah, Holmes struck the spine of the book with his finger. There you have it. The resemblance was no accident. He was indeed her son, her eldest, born secretly before her marriage to Sir Edmund Kent. She concealed him to protect her title. He came to reclaim his name, not for profit alone, but for acknowledgement. The tragedy lay not in greed, but in the collision of denial and pride. The revelation struck me with both clarity and a kind of sorrow. Good Lord, Holmes, you mean she kept silent even as she knew who he was? Yes. She had received those first letters months earlier, recognized the handwriting of the father, and dared not answer. When at last he came in person, bringing resemblance and proof too perfect to deny, she planned to yield with conditions. She meant to recognize him privately, not publicly, to restore to him the estate of Blackmere, but none of the name. Yet when she saw the madness of desperation in his eyes, the chemist's stain upon his hands, she sought escape, rang the bell, but too late. He resumed pacing, his voice low and reflective now. What fascinates me most is not the cruelty of guilt, but its precision. Every crime, Watson, begins not with a motive but with a misunderstanding. Rosier mistook denial for betrayal, while Lady Kent mistook secrecy for protection. Those few seconds when she reached for the bell were the sum of their histories catching flame. I sat back, pen ready, knowing he would soon fall into the rare quiet that marked the close of his intellectual exertion. But he went on, his tone softer. Do you recall her final manner, the peaceful aspect Lestrade described? There was more than cyanide in that stillness. It was release. The burden of deceit lifted even in death. He turned away from the fire then, and his gaze found the window. Outside, the streets had brightened faintly under a break in the clouds. A carriage rolled past, the clop of hooves echoing from the stones. At last he said, It is finished, then. Rosier's confession will stand, and justice will move as it always does, slowly, inexorably. Yet one must not judge a soul by the fog surrounding it. Had he come to me in honesty, I might have helped him claim the truth without blood. I could not help but smile at this faint spark of humility, rare though it was. Even you, Holmes, cannot undo pride and bloodlines. He gave a short, dry laugh. No, Watson, but I can observe how nature repeats itself. Even the cleverest of men may become a victim of their own history. He sat then, his mood easing, and reached for his violin. The first strains rose soft and plaintive, weaving around the quiet room like the mist that had haunted us through our long night of pursuit. I wrote in my journal as he played, for it seemed to me a fitting close, that logic had unveiled truth but not solace. And when he lowered the bow at last, Holmes said, not without a trace of weariness, You see, my dear Watson, the locked parlor was never locked at all. It was opened years before by secrecy and silence. He leaned back, eyes half closed, the firelight etching his profile. One may solve a mystery, Watson, but some hearts remain sealed chambers forever. And so ended the affair of the mother found in the locked parlor, a case that lingered with me long after the evening's music faded, for it revealed not merely the art of Holmes's deduction, but the strange mercy that dwelt beneath his intellect. Holmes did not speak again for some time after laying down his violin. The instrument rested against his knee, the last lingering note still quivering in the air like a conscience unwilling to fade. Outside, the dawn was building steadily into morning. The world beyond Baker Street stirred awake, the first tradesman calling out, wheels striking cobblestones, the faint cry of a milk cart somewhere over the hum of the waking city. I thought the case concluded, that Holmes's remarkable mind would already have turned to another curiosity. Yet when the fire sank low and Mrs. Hudson knocked softly to clear our breakfast plates, he remained at his chair, his eyes fixed on the dying coals. At length he said, Watson, I am not satisfied. Not satisfied? I repeated. Good heavens, man, every piece is accounted for. The confession, the motive, the proof of relation. What more would you have? Completion, perhaps, he murmured. Or understanding. They are not the same, my dear fellow. Rosier's story was linear, yes. It runs cleanly from intent to crime. But life seldom runs straight. There is an angle still bent out of sight. The precision of the locked room staging, the bell's singular timing, the empty vial, all convenient, all too precise. I have long learned that perfection, in murder as in art, is the most certain sign of artificiality. He rose suddenly, crossing to the mantel where the burnt remains of the letter still lay folded in a small packet. He lifted the ash gently between his fingers, then crushed it, letting it fall again. She was a woman not to invite the random cruelty of chance. That bell was her final communication, not a cry for help. Holmes, I said, weary but intrigued, what are you implying? You believe she signaled someone? He nodded faintly. Or someone else was in that corridor before the servants reached her door. I stared at him, astonished. You suspect the daughter? Not suspect, Watson, observe. Miss Kent's statements were curiously consistent, curiously quick. She recalled every time, every detail as though rehearsed. A woman in grief speaks with breaks, confusions, but hers bore structure. It was grief measured, prepared. I think she knew more of her mother's morning visitor than she chose to say. I opened my mouth to object, but Holmes's eyes silenced me. It would explain several peculiarities, he continued. Rosier believed himself the son of the late Sir Edmund, but suppose he had been told so by another. Miss Kent found herself facing loss of inheritance once her mother legitimized him. A single meeting alone in that parlor could destroy her future. Yet she let him enter freely, encouraged the encounter even. What better opportunity to let tragedy intervene than an interview that could not be witnessed? You mean to say, Holmes raised a hand. Patience, Watson. I accuse no one yet, but recall the condition of the vial. It was placed as display, too neat, too close to the chair. An impostor would conceal, not exhibit the weapon. That arrangement suggests not guilt, but orchestration after death. Lestrade's men found only her body, the vial, the key upon her chain. Yet who restored the armchair to order? Who closed the parlor windows that the gardener later found bolted from within? The poison was Rosier's, yes, but its theatre. His voice dropped low, his eyes narrowed. That belonged to another mind entirely. My pulse quickened. Then what must we do? Wait, said Holmes. Observe whether fate, like conscience, compels another confession. We waited nearly 2 days. The news of Rosier's arrest had spread swiftly through the morning papers. Eliza Kent remained at Greyhaven Manor, managing funeral arrangements. On the third morning, a messenger arrived, a young footman trembling from haste, with a note addressed to Holmes in a neat feminine hand. He read it once, then twice, before folding it silently. Without a word, he donned his coat. Watson, fetch your hat. We returned to Greyhaven. The journey was brief and silent. The manor loomed grey against a dim winter's afternoon. Miss Kent awaited us in her mother's study, pale but composed. She dismissed the servants and faced Holmes alone. You received my letter, she said quietly. You came. Holmes inclined his head. When a truth presses its author so near the brink of silence, I make it my duty to listen. She lowered her gaze, fingers twisting at a lace handkerchief. It must be said, Mr. Holmes, before the inquest proceeds. He did not mean to harm her. He only wished to be known. I swear that to you. And yet he killed her, Holmes replied, softly but without sympathy. Whether by chance or purpose, his hand carried the poison. It was not in his hand, she whispered. It was in mine. Holmes did not move. Nor did I breathe, she went on, barely above a whisper. He came as my mother expected, and I greeted him first. He seemed kind, strangely gentle. He told me he wanted nothing but acknowledgement. I believed him. But when my mother arrived, she would not even let him speak. She refused to hear his name. They argued, such words I cannot repeat. She called him an invention of deceit. I tried to part them, to calm her, but he left the room in despair. Then she turned to me in fury, saying I had ruined us both, that his claim left me nameless. I saw her vial, the one she used for her medicines, lying open upon the table. I had touched it earlier. It burned my fingers. I knew what it held. I thought if she saw her cruelty reflected, if I placed it there before her chair, she might relent, might see what her denial had done. She pressed the bell, saw it, and I think she understood. She reached to remove the cork. Before I could stop her, her breath clouded and she fell back. I never meant it. I swear I never meant it. There was a pause so deep that the clock on the mantel seemed to fill it entirely. Then Holmes said almost kindly, "You placed the scene in order. The fire rekindled, the window secured, so the world would never see your mother's last defiance. You loved her even in her wrath." Tears blurred her eyes. "I loved her too well. I only wished to protect her name." Holmes looked upon her for a long moment, then turned toward the door. "The truth, Miss Kent, will rest between the living and the dead. But I fear the law will not prove so gentle." Later, as we drove away from Greyhaven beneath the late afternoon sky, I turned to Holmes. "You will tell Lestrade?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Watson. There are crimes the law cannot measure, and truth's best left unspoken. The dead have found their peace. Let the living find theirs in silence." He settled back, the faintest hint of melancholy tracing his profile. "We solved the riddle of the locked parlor, my friend," he said at last, "but every lock demands a price. In this case the key was love, and the cost as ever unbearable." And the wheels clattered on, carrying us through the dissolving fog as the last of the Kent tragedy vanished behind the veil of London's grey horizon. The fog had settled thickly again by the time we neared our lodgings. Holmes, usually so talkative when the strands of a case had been tied at last, remained in a silence heavier than I had heard from him in months. The hum of the cab's wheels seemed to echo the rhythm of thought behind his still features. Every revolution, a quiet, relentless count of what justice demanded and what mercy had denied. When at last we alighted at Baker Street, he removed his hat with an air more weary than satisfied, as though the weight of the case had followed him even into familiar walls. He seated himself at once before the fire that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully stirred into brightness, but he did not remove his coat. "Watson," he said, "this affair troubles me, not for its complexity but for its fatal symmetry. It was too complete a design. Every action mirrored another, each motive bound by love and shame. That is why it feels wrong to let it end as it stands." I poured him brandy. He took it absently. "You did what conscience demanded, Holmes. You uncovered truth, as always. No man can compel the law to show compassion, but you gave it cause to hesitate." He gave a short laugh, low and thoughtful. "Ah, my dear fellow, compassion, the most erratic of all human variables. The law requires consistency. Sentiment does not. I sometimes wonder whether the latter is nearer to justice." He reached for his violin but laid it aside again, his restlessness refusing the solace of its strings. "Miss Eliza Kent. What now of her, Watson?" "She will stand before a coroner's jury," I said quietly. "But any verdict will fall short of understanding. Her confession, to you alone, leaves her both condemned and unaccused." Holmes mused aloud. "And so she inherits precisely what her mother intended. Silence." He rose and began pacing, his long shadow thrown across the shelves of chemical apparatus and books. "There is an irony here, Watson. The son, unnamed, sought recognition and found death. The daughter, named and cherished, sought concealment and found guilt. Between them lay a mother who would have denied both for propriety's sake. Her trinity of secrecy, each destroying the other." He turned abruptly, fixing me with that fierce glint which so often heralded revelation. "Do you recall the first words I spoke upon receiving Lestrade's summons?" I searched my memory. "You said, 'It appears at first blush to involve the impossible.'" "Indeed. I was correct, though not in the way I supposed. The impossibility was moral, not mechanical. A locked room, sealed from within, but the door between truth and falsehood had been opened long ago." He stopped pacing and gazed into the hearth, where the fire flared and dimmed like a heartbeat. "This case, Watson, was never about the cunning of means. It was about the desperate logic of silence. Every act, the poison, the letter, the bell, was not to conceal a crime, but to preserve a name." He sank into his chair and clasped his hands. A faint smile touched his lips, tinged with melancholy. "Do you know, my friend, that I once believed deduction could pierce any veil, that reason, if fine enough, would reach the heart of any mystery. But this shows me there are puzzles so human that reason itself becomes part of the fog." I was silent. The conviction in his voice needed no reply. We sat that way for some minutes, listening to the faint hiss of rain at the windows. Then Holmes leaned forward suddenly. "I have sent no notice to Lestrade, not yet. You understand me, Watson? Let the official narrative stand. Death by cyanide. self-administered under mistaken trust. It will satisfy the world, and the world deserves only the measure of truth it can bear. You will let her go? I asked. He frowned slightly. She will go nowhere. She will live, and that, I think, will be punishment enough. The hardest prison is memory. He rose, and this time he did take up the violin. The bow drew softly across the strings, the notes slow at first, then rising into a phrase that carried the tenderness and torment of all we had witnessed. The melody wound through the smoke-hazed air, filling the room with something between lament and absolution. It was not music meant to impress or display. It was Holmes speaking in his truest language. As he played, I thought of Lady Kent's final gesture, of the unspoken recognition between mother and daughter, the bell that rang not for help but forgiveness. In that faint, trembling sound lay the soul of the tragedy, a communication across barriers none of us had quite understood until too late. When the last note faded, Holmes turned toward me with a quiet smile, his eyes distant. You see, Watson, even the purest solution leaves residue. In science we call it byproduct. In life it is remorse. We shared the silence that followed, the sort that binds old friends who have seen too much of both reason and folly. Outside the rain had ceased, and the pale winter light crept into the room, softening the lines of his tired face. For the first time in years, Holmes looked almost humanly frail. A man touched by the griefs he so often disassembled without feeling. He set the violin aside and spoke one final time, half to himself. Strange, is it not, that the most intricate of mysteries should end not with revelation but reflection? The case is closed, yet the heart remains open. I dare say, Watson, there lies the eternal interval between fact and truth, and with that, he turned back to the fire, the smoke curling upward like the last sigh of Greyhaven Manor itself, vanishing into the quiet of another London morning. Through the late morning, Holmes remained in quiet contemplation, only the faint clinking of teacups upon saucers or the low rumble of a distant carriage outside intruding upon our peace. I busied myself with notes, watching him from the corner of my eye as he sketched occasional figures in his notebook, chemical formulae, the spiral of a bell cord, or perhaps merely the restless geometry of regret. London's bustle returned with the noon hour and a fresh wave of correspondence, but Holmes turned them all away. He would admit no clients, take no cases, until the heavy residue of the Kent affair had settled in him. I found, as always at such times, my admiration for his intellect, tempered by the strange loneliness that so often followed his most demanding victories. I too felt the case's lingering shadow. In the arrangement of Lady Kent's effects, the echo of Eliza's confession, the final, fragile truce Holmes had struck with his own conscience. It was late in the day when a knock brought Inspector Lestrade round, his usual impatience masked by a new tentative caution. He glanced sidelong at Holmes, uncertain, as if debating how much of what had passed at Greyhaven ought to be discussed within the civilized order of Baker Street. Afternoon. Mr. Holmes, Doctor. I imagine you'll be wanting news of your French gentleman, Rosier. There's to be a hearing, and likely more than a few questions about the lady's finances and the exotic chemicals in that cottage of his. Holmes offered a faint, cordial smile. No doubt, Inspector. The world's appetite for questions is never sated, least of all when tragedy walks in on the hour. Lestrade hesitated. And the daughter? Holmes only shook his head. For the jury will find what they are shown. A daughter tending her mother, a family scandal averted, Ned Rosier's fate determined by his own deeds. It is justice, of the sort men can write down, at least. The silence said all that needed saying, and Lestrade excused himself in short order, his brisk footsteps receding down the stair. When we were alone again, Holmes at last addressed me without the tired distance of earlier. Come, Watson. We may do no more here. There is good in studying pain, but excess is toxic. Like cyanide, it must be taken in the smallest recommended dose. He rose, fetching his hat and coat. I joined him gratefully, relieved to be moving once more away from the study's four close walls. Walk, Holmes. A necessity, not a pleasure today. We lost ourselves among the winding lanes behind Marylebone, the city's autumnal dampness lending a peculiar hush to even the busiest arcades. For a long stretch, Holmes walked in brisk silence, fixing his eyes not upon passers-by, but, it seemed, upon some point far beyond our sight. Then quietly he resumed in that particular, philosophical cadence I had come to expect after every truly profound case. I have been forced, Watson, to re-examine an old premise that reason alone is sovereign in human affairs. The Kent case has proved again how logic itself can serve secrets, how it can shore up tragedy rather than dissolve it. I nodded, knowing he was not truly inviting an answer. My methods permit me to trace the shape of deceit, the sequence of events, yet in the end I am faced with a residue, the intangible cost. I find I am far less certain than ever that the truth entire is what most require. "You believe you have erred, then?" I asked as gently as I could. He stopped at the corner of a flower stall, the faint perfume of late roses drifting amidst a fleet of handsome cabs. "Not erred, Watson, only understood my limitations anew. The law must play its part. So must silence. You see, in the end, we solve for the living, not the dead. And sometimes the living must be allowed to keep their secrets." We stood there in the failing light, Holmes gazing at the flowers with a faint, half-ironic smile. "Let us return home, Watson, before my character becomes too sentimental for civilized company. There will be other puzzles, other locked rooms. I assure you not one will defeat me for want of method." The old spark kindled anew in his eye, the promise of untold riddles yet to come. We resumed our journey, the city closing around us with the comfort of familiarity. Holmes took up his brisk step again, and though the echo of the locked parlor seemed to trail behind him, it was clear the case had now retreated into that gallery of strange and haunting outcomes, which only he, in all his solitary genius, was equipped to bear. I resolved, as always, to record the truth, what little might serve, while sparing the greater tenderness behind each reasoning mind and wounded heart. As our door closed behind us at Baker Street and Holmes lit his pipe, the ordinary clatter of the evening resumed, and I almost believed for a moment that logic and mercy were not always at such perilous odds. And so the affair of Greyhaven Manor came to its curious, quiet close, a mystery resolved, a tragedy concealed, and the smallest glimmers of forgiveness stirring between the columns of deduction and doubt. The evening deepened, and the comforting hum of London returned to its familiar rhythm outside 221B Baker Street. The fire had burned low, casting a soft orange glow across the cluttered tables and chemical apparatus of our sitting room. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the rug, his pipe smoked down to the stem, the blue haze curling languidly about him. Though his body appeared relaxed, I could sense the restless motion of his mind beneath the facade of calm, the way a hawk never truly dwells at rest, even upon its perch. I had just closed my journal, having written the final lines of what I believed would be the last account of the Kent affair, when Holmes spoke without looking up. "Watson, do you recall the sound of the parlor bell described by Miss Kent?" The question caught me unprepared. "A small handbell. She said it rang once sharply and then ceased. What of it?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Once sharply," he repeated. "Not the continuous toll we should expect from panic. I have been turning that phrase over in my mind, and I cannot escape the suspicion that the bell's tone holds significance beyond symbol or circumstance." I frowned. "Surely you do not suggest some new turn to an already resolved affair?" "Resolved?" He smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, every case is a mirror. Each time we study one, it returns an image of ourselves, slightly altered. The murderer may be in custody, or in this case confession settled, but the truth is an equation. Should even a single variable remain untested, the result, however elegant, is false." I sighed, accustomed to these intellectual aftershocks that often followed his greatest deductions. "Then what does this single ring signify to you?" He leaned forward, tapping the ash from his pipe onto the hearth. "It signifies time, Watson. Not alarm, but appointment. A prearranged signal heard by more than one person." My astonishment must have shown, for he added almost gently, Yes, I know what you will say. The house contained only Miss Kent, her brother, and the servants, all accounted for. Yet the expression I recall upon her face when we arrived, an expression not merely of grief, but of anticipation, was that of a woman who expected a reckoning. She had rung that bell once before under different conditions. I suspect she repeated it at the last as a message not to summon but to conclude. I stared at him in silence for a moment, uncertain whether Holmes spoke of the living woman or her departed mother. His meaning hung between the two like balancing scales. Then, quietly, he added, "It is possible Miss Kent was answering a call rather than making one." Before I could form a reply, a knock came at the door, light but distinct. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram upon her tray. Holmes accepted it absently, broke the seal, and scanned the contents. His sharp features softened into something like resignation. "Ah, Lestrade," he said, efficient as ever. He passed me the slip of paper. The telegram read, "Rosier dead during transport. Collapsed through cyanide inhalation. Suspected self-poisoning. Kindly advise if any further evidence pertains." Holmes's lips pressed thin. "And so the circle completes itself," he said softly. "The son claims the poison that began with his mother. The debt closes. The secret goes to ground." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, peering through the thin veil of smoke into the cold, motionless night beyond. "Do you think it's suicide?" I asked. "What difference, Watson, between deliberate death and a man crushed beneath the weight of inevitability?" His profile was drawn and austere against the lamplight. "Some tragedies release their victims long before the act itself. I knew Rosier was lost the moment I looked into his eyes. For some time we remained silent. The street outside was still. Even the horses in the cab stand had grown subdued. At last I ventured, "Then the bell, Holmes. Its significance dies. With him?" He turned back to me, the faintest trace of melancholy shadowing his smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it chimes still in the conscience of one who survives. You see, Watson, it was never truly a signal of alarm, but of acknowledgement, a summoning of what could no longer be hidden. In that sense, its echo may outlast them all." He resumed his seat, staring into the fire. "Strange, is it not? A single toll that awakened no one, yet stirred an entire house of secrets. If there be any moral in this business, and heaven knows morals are hardly my métier, it is that truth, once sounded, cannot be silenced entirely even by love." The fatigue that accompanies intellectual victory began to settle upon him. His shoulders relaxed. His gaze lost the distant gleam of pursuit. After a long pause, he took up his violin once more. The melody that rose this time was not mournful, as before, but tender, its phrasing deliberate, almost forgiving. It was a nocturne against the dark, a gesture of reconciliation played for ghosts. As I sat listening, I looked toward the window, where the faint mist of London glowed under the gas lamps. In that soft, uncertain light, I fancied I could see the figures of Greyhaven Manor, the lady at her parlor window, the remorseful daughter, the doomed son whose story had ended before it truly began. All three were linked now by the invisible thread that Holmes alone had traced through the labyrinth of tragedy, the thread of human weakness bound to love. When at last the bow fell silent, Holmes set the instrument aside and smiled faintly, as though his own melancholy had eased. "Watson," he said, "should posterity ever record this affair, file it not among our triumphs but our lessons. For once the science of deduction was forced to bow to the greater science of mercy." I nodded, closed my notebook, and reached forward to stoke the fire. The flames flared up briefly, scattering their light across the littered table, where the last clues of the case lay forgotten. A burned envelope, a torn ribbon, an empty vial, all now meaningless remnants of lives spent in secrecy. When I finally looked back at him, Holmes had nodded off in his chair, one arm draped loosely over the violin upon his lap. The smoke from his pipe still curled toward the ceiling, a pale white thread rising unbroken into the dimness above. And there it remained, that final symbol of the case, fragile yet enduring. Like the last breath of a woman who had wrung one, bell too late, and of a man who, for all his brilliance, could no longer discern where reason ended and compassion began. The fire burned lower as the hours drifted past, and the last ribbons of pipe smoke hung above us, like pale ghosts that refused to depart. Holmes had dozed briefly, the exhaustion of his mental exertions claiming him, but I knew him too well to be deceived by the pose of repose. Even behind closed lids, that tremendous intellect of his never truly slept. It merely waited, listening to the quiet calculations of the city that throbbed beyond the window panes. Presently he stirred, opening his eyes with a slow exhale. "You are still awake, Watson," he murmured. "I could hardly rest," I returned. "Your reasoning occupies me still. The bell, the mother, the daughter, each piece has its logic, but the aftertaste of the affair lingers. It feels, somehow, unfinished." Holmes smiled faintly. "You echo my own thoughts. Closure for a detective is an illusion, especially when truth and compassion collide. Still, I find the case complete in its geometry, if not in its sentiment." He leaned forward, stoking the embers with the iron poker until they flared again into life. "You see, Watson, what you call lingering unease is not incompleteness, it is consequence. No conclusion exists without remainder." He lapsed into silence. I knew better than to interrupt when he spoke thus, in those rare moments when logic gave way to philosophy. The faint hiss of the fire punctuated the ticking of the clock, the very sound that marked the passage of time through all our shared curiosities, triumphs and tragedies. After a time, however, his mood lightened. He rose, stretching his lean frame and crossing to his writing desk. "A note for Lestrade," he said lightly. "One must maintain a veneer of finality for Scotland Yard, else they believe me haunted by every case. We cannot have that. His sense of professional superiority could not withstand the strain." He dipped his pen, the scratch of steel on paper crisp and measured. "Watson, I shall commend the inspector on his diligence, urge him to ensure Miss Kent's well-being, and offer condolences for Rosier's end. All polite fictions, but not falsehoods. The world, as ever, requires its conclusions wrapped neatly in ink and official seals." I smiled. "And you, Holmes? What will you do with the truth that no report can contain?" He looked up from his writing, eyes catching the light of the lamplight with that glint half sardonic, half weary. "File it here." He tapped his temple. "Among the unsolved certainties, truth so dangerous they must not be uttered, yet so necessary they cannot be forgotten. You may find half a page in your notes for what you call my softer judgment. History will supply the rest with its usual distortion." When the letter was done, he sealed it with a swift touch of the wax stick and tossed it aside to dry. "There, my friend. Another ghost made respectable for public consumption." Then he sank once more into his chair, drawing his hands together beneath his chin, eyes bright once more with that peculiar fire which, for him, burned stronger in reflection than in pursuit. "The curious thing about guilt," he continued after a moment, "is that it rarely requires discovery to do its work. Rosier's sense of it was fatal, long before cyanide found his lungs. Miss Kent, though spared by silence, will live beneath the same invisible weight. I imagine Greyhaven will never again be open to society. The house will remain a mausoleum, perhaps, for the old and bitter secrets that built it. Does that trouble you?" I asked gently. He considered the question, his expression neither stern nor tender, but balanced in that strange, critical calm so peculiar to him. "Once it would have. When I was younger, I sought to untangle every knot, certain that truth alone justified existence. But I have come to see that there are knots life itself must wear, threads that bind even as they mar the weave. Perhaps that is why this case affects me more deeply than I expected. It has taught me humility, though it masquerades as success." His words lingered between us, heavy yet strangely comforting. I realized then how deeply the case had touched him, not as an enigma solved, but as a lesson earned. The afternoon finally gave way to dusk once more, the rain beginning to prattle faintly against the windows. Holmes, restless again, rose and crossed to the mantel, where the violin had been left unattended since morning. He lifted it with reverence, testing the tension of the strings before drawing the bow gently across them. The sound that resulted was neither dirge nor triumph, but something exquisitely in between, a meditation, a question without an answer. I stood by the window, looking down at Baker Street below. A lamplighter was making his rounds, setting each gas lamp aflame. The glow spilled into trembling halos upon the wet stones, and within their reflections, I watched a child chase his own boot prints through the puddles. The fragile simplicity of it unsettled me. After so much intricate pain, so much moral calculus, it seemed indecent that life should continue so heedlessly, so unscarred. Holmes's playing faded to quiet arpeggios. "You see, Watson," he said softly, The pattern holds. Pain concludes, but life resumes, indifferent to its echoes. That, in the end, may be the greatest mystery of all. I turned back toward him, meaning to answer, but found the words unnecessary. Whatever could be said had already been expressed, in smoke, in sound, in silence. He lowered the bow, the last notes fading into the steady rhythm of falling rain. He smiled then, faintly but truly, that rare smile that softened the austere lines of his face. "Come, my dear fellow," he said, setting the violin aside. "We shall dine. No philosophy without nourishment. Mrs. Hudson will scold us if we spoil another evening's meal talking ghosts and justice." Together we went down to supper, leaving behind the studied order of the sitting-room, where the fire burned low and the faint scent of tobacco hung suspended like a coda. There would be other cases, other riddles calling from the dark alleys and drawing-rooms of London, but for that night at least, the great detective rested, not defeated nor wholly at peace, but reconciled to the one truth no deduction could alter, that every locked door, once opened, leaves behind a quiet room no theory can fill. The supper that night was uncharacteristically quiet. Holmes, having eaten little, turned his thoughts once more to the hearth, staring into the last glow of the fire as though reading some last residual clue written there in flame and shadow. I, too, said little, unwilling to disturb what I sensed to be the final unravelling of his mind from the web of the case. When at last he spoke, his voice bore the steady tone of meditation rather than revelation. "Watson, the tragedy of Greyhaven was not in its crime but in its concealment. Every death I have witnessed bears some mark of folly, but few are so purely shaped by silence. Had one of them, just one, spoken truly, the others might yet have lived." He rose then, crossing to the shelves, and drew from one of his files a slim folder bound by ribbon. He opened it briefly, scanned a few scribbled pages, and smiled faintly. "I shall enter Greyhaven among the closed investigations, though it deserves a more peculiar classification. Perhaps a case solved beyond redemption." He replaced the file and turned back, the lamplight cutting across the keen planes of his face. "You see, my dear Watson," he went on, "science can reconstruct a death but not absolve a life. Lestrade will have his verdict, the law its cause, and the newspapers their epilogue. But the greater truth, the inheritance of guilt through blood and silence, belongs solely to human frailty. No court adjudicates such matters." I could not help but reply, "And yet you sound more priest than logician tonight, Holmes." He laughed quietly. Perhaps the sermon was inevitable after so many confessions. But mark me, Watson, deduction remains my faith, though this case reminds me that the Divine Comedy often mocks its disciples. He leaned against the mantel, his gaze softening. "Rosier is gone. Miss Kent will not return to society. The estate will pass quietly into trusteeship, until ivy and neglect consume what scandal left untouched. One wonders in the centuries to come whether Greyhaven will still echo its single bell, or if time has the decency to overlook even the most careful sins." The wind had begun to rise beyond Baker Street, stirring the chimney flue so that the fire guttered low. I felt the familiar sense of finality that followed Holmes's rare reflections, the certainty that a case, however tangled, had reached its rightful rest in his mind. And yet something in his composure, the almost wistful calm, compelled me to ask, "Will you never tell her story as it was, Holmes? The truth as you know it?" He regarded me for a moment, then shook his head gently. "No, there is kindness in omission. The world is suffused with half-truths, Watson. Sometimes it is only among them that compassion can breathe. Let the official record stand, a tragic accident, the end of a family's misfortune. No ink of mine will reopen what silence has mercifully sealed." A long pause followed, the quiet made intimate by the patter of rain upon the window. Then he added in a voice half to himself, "Each locked room, each puzzle, these are merely reflections of the human condition. We construct walls to protect our secrets, and in doing so we trap ourselves within them. The detective merely arrives to open a door, but he can never restore what the air of concealment has already poisoned." He fell silent, and I saw the faint weariness in him that triumph never concealed. The violin rested by his side upon the table, its polished grain glimmering like amber in the firelight. Without another word, he drew the bow across the strings, this time a tune soft as breath and full of quiet release, a melody without beginning or end. The notes rose and lingered, hovering like a final clause in an unspoken confession. The sound filled that humble room with the fragile peace that only resolution can bring, not victory, but understanding. It seemed to me that even the fog outside paused a moment to listen before drifting back down Baker Street, carrying with it the echo of a single bell that might never ring again. When the music faded, I closed my notebook upon the final line of my record. Holmes set the violin aside and turned toward the darkness outside. His reflection caught faintly upon the glass, a man both defined and undone by his pursuit of truth. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "not every lock is meant to be opened. Some doors, once unsealed, reveal only the loneliness of those who built them." I left him then before the fire, the coals flickering low, his silhouette steady as a statue amid the drifting smoke. And so ended the case of the mother found in the locked parlor, a story that, to its solver, was less a victory of intellect than a requiem for silence itself. Even now, when the wind stirs through the London streets at night, I sometimes imagine I hear that faint chime again, a single, measured ring, the last toll of a house that hid its heart too well.